how life works at conferences on the third day, it's an absolutely great honor for me to be able to present to you now Professor Alison Landsberg, who is the director of the Center of Humanities Research at George Mason University in the US. Now, she is an absolutely prominent scholar, of course, in the field of memory studies. I think anybody familiar with our neighboring field, I would say, of memory studies will know her name, and undoubtedly, mostly because of her highly influential book, Prosthetic Memory, The Transformation of American Remembrance in the Age of Mass Culture. It's a book published in 2004 by Cambridge University Press. Now, in that book, which is extremely close to the topic of our conference, she considers the way in which individuals, due to all kinds of media technology, are increasingly and techniques are able to take on memories of events that they didn't live through themselves. She is interested in how this potential of such memories can produce empathy and become the ground for a progressive politics. And her book has been discussed in a journal very familiar to us theorists of history, namely in Rethinking History. It's a fascinating forum of 2007. I can recommend it to everybody. Actually, we've been reading it in a small reading group in Ghent together with the work of Professor Landsberg. Now, she also has a more recent book that I think really fits super closely with the main topic of her conference, and the 2015 book, Engaging the Past, in which she explores the popular modes of engagement with the past in contemporary mediated society, and the ramifications of those modes of engagement for projects of history and politics. And she argues that these popular engagements do pose some fundamental challenges for our sense of what constitutes history in the 21st century. But she also shows that academics actually need to take far more seriously the kind of work that popular media and the kind of potential that popular media have for the production of historical knowledge. Now, Alison has been a keynote and invited speaker all over the world, including Norway, the UK, the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, France, and I'm super happy to be able to add Mexico, at least virtually, to that list. And so, thanks again for accepting our invitation, and I would like to grant you the floor, Alison. So if you could share your PowerPoint and give it a few seconds for it to turn up on our screen. It works, you'll see. Yeah, okay, that's great. Yes, it turned up here, and the little screen will also appear here with us in the room in a few seconds. Okay, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Berber. I want to thank you so much for inviting me, and also Lisette and Luis for inviting me to speak at this conference. I was very eager to come to Puebla in 2020, and I'm so sorry that I'm not able to be with you all there now, but I'm really incredibly grateful for the opportunity to participate virtually. Thank you for that lovely introduction to my work also, Berber. Those of you who know my work know that I take seriously mass culture. My work on museums, films, and television has focused on the modes of engagement they solicit from individuals and the possibilities therein for the production and acquisition of memory, historical knowledge and consciousness, and political subjectivity in the public sphere. My talk today is also in that vein. Despite daily evidence to the contrary, one of the most powerful national narratives in the US is that the racialized violence upon which the nation was founded, violence that was constitutive of chattel slavery and that was perpetuated in the racial terror lynchings during Jim Crow, has been gradually overcome by the long civil rights movement, culminating in a post-racial America, evidenced most forcefully by the election of Barack Obama, the first Black president of the United States. The idea of a post-racial America, that the nation had finally transcended racial division, was at best a convenient and comforting story most Americans were all too happy to embrace, and at worst, a cover story, or what Mimi White has called an alibi discourse, which enabled the undoing of affirmative action and the unraveling of voting right protections. Of course, the hollowness of the post-racial, that it was nothing more than a mystique, as Catherine Squires has argued, was made clear with the election of Donald J. Trump in 2016 and in the subsequent rise of overt racism in popular discourse in the public sphere. And yet, the narrative of America as a nation built on a promise of freedom and equality for all, a nation in which racialized violence had been relegated to a shameful past, endures as a key component of our national narrative. What I want to suggest here is that at the current conjuncture, mass culture, and television in particular, has become a significant and productive site for challenges to that narrative. Scholars of history on film, many of whom are here at this conference, have long argued for the power of the medium to shape and inform the way people think about the past. What I want to point to here is the emergence of what I see as a novel form of history writing on film and television. A form of history writing that's not premised on the logics or temporality of historicism, and which is enabled by formal, generic, narrative, and most significantly, temporal possibilities of these audiovisual media, undertaken by African-American producers and directors, and that these are challenging and undermining what has become a hegemonic narrative of racial progress in the US, and which has remained largely intractable in the popular imagination. I situate this work of rewriting the national narrative in the mass cultural public sphere alongside the groundbreaking work of the 1619 Project undertaken by Nicole Hannah-Jones and others, and amid the creation of new museums and memorials like the Legacy Museum and the Museum for Peace and Justice created by the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, all of which share the goal of centering racialized violence in the US national narrative. Mass culture has often been understood in the terms set out by the Frankfurt School theorists Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer in the 1940s as the site of mass deception. The culture industry, as they called it, refers to industrially produced culture under capitalism, film, radio, and television, which they argued homogenizes and pacifies audience, all the while indoctrinating them with capitalist ideology. In this account, a commodified mass culture always and tirelessly reproduces its own logics, its products, films, radio, popular music, inevitably disseminate dominant ideologies and with them the status quo. But there was a countervailing argument about mass culture that was articulated at the same moment by Walter Benjamin and Siegfried Kracauer. While they too understood that mass culture was thoroughly saturated with the logics of capitalism, they saw its effects in less monolithic terms. Siegfried Kracauer understood that mass culture, all cultural services really, provide access to the material truths of society. He writes, He writes, the position that an epoch occupies in the historical process can be determined more strikingly from an analysis of its inconspicuous surface level expressions than from the epoch's judgments about itself. In fact, it is the unconscious nature of these surface level expressions that enable them to offer unmediated access to the fundamental substance of the state of things. Like his friend and interlocutor, Walter Benjamin, he understood the power of the new visual technologies of modernity to alter visibility, to render things previously unseen or unnoted newly visible. Benjamin pointed to what he called the optical unconscious, the capacity of the photograph to make visible to viewers that which remained invisible to the naked eye. For him, this was both literal and metaphorical. Photography and film, he believed, could reveal entirely new structures of the subject in a scientific sense, like the microscope, but it might also make visible aspects of the social world that we do not see because they have become reified, second nature. He saw, in other words, a radical, even revolutionary capacity in photography and film to explode the present. Our bars and city streets, our offices and furnished rooms, our railroad stations and our factories seemed to close relentlessly around us. Then came film and exploded this prison world with the dynamite of a split second, so that now we can set off calmly on journeys of adventure among its far-flung debris. With the close-up, space expands, with slow motion, movement is extended, and just as enlargement not merely clarifies what we see indistinctly in any case, but brings to light entirely new structures of matter. Slow motion not only reveals familiar aspects of movements, but discloses quite unknown aspects within them. Clearly, it is another nature which speaks to the camera as compared to the eye. For Benjamin, in other words, instead of only ever pacifying audience, mass culture retained a utopian potential precisely because it might make that which has been unseen suddenly seeable and on a mass scale. This investment in the visual, as I will explain shortly, manifests itself as well in Benjamin's conceptualization of materialist history and his centerpiece, the dialectical image. To understand why the narrative of racial progress in the US has been so intractable also requires a consideration of the methodological commitments of the form of history writing that Benjamin describes as historicism, and which, in his words, contents itself with establishing a causal nexus of various moments of history. Historicism, in this sense, is built on methodological, temporal, and narrative requirements, critical distance from the object of inquiry, change over time, among others, which, when taken together, have the effect of obscuring those aspects of the supposed past that persist in the present. Even those historians whose research is motivated by a desire to understand the present tend to rely on a methodology premised on rigorously separating the present from the past. Fundamental to the discipline's methodology is a belief that to achieve something like objectivity requires critical distance, a temporal break between the past and the present. The historian's work is premised on this temporal break, one that fosters the sense that, in David Lowenthal's words, the past is a foreign country. But this methodological move has epistemological implications. It renders the present as telos. By relegating to the past dynamics that are ongoing, history is less adept at making visible the continued presence of those historical dynamics, and I put that in quotes. This form of history writing thus has the unintended consequence of obscuring the ways in which those dynamics continue to animate and exert pressure on the present. And this, of course, has political implications. Berber Bevernage has pointed to the ways in which modern historical discourse is taken up in the language of truth commissions, primarily in order to support the national project of simultaneity by insisting on a modernist rupture between past and present. Bevernage is here arguing that as long as state-sponsored racial violence remains a topic of history, it can be considered over and done safely in the past and thereby unavailable for political projects in the present. So the point is that the logic of historicism undergirds this powerful national narrative in the US. Walter Benjamin argued for the value of what he called a materialist history, and which has an altogether different temporal structure from historicism. Writing in the wake of World War I and against the backdrop of the rise of fascism in Germany, Benjamin theorized a counter-hegemonic practice of history that was decidedly political and that was premised on what he described as dialectical images, constellations of the past and the present. In opposition to a form of history writing that rigorously separates the past from the present, Benjamin imagined them as dialectically connected to one another. In describing this materialist history, he writes, "To articulate what is past does not mean to recognize how it really was. It means to take control of a memory as it flashes in a moment of danger." There are three significant aspects to this claim for the argument that I am making about history writing in contemporary mass culture. One, the temporality of materialist history is neither linear nor monodirectional. Two, there is a visual and visualizable dimension to this radical form of history writing. And three, the project of articulating the past historically does not require that we recognize how it really was. The centerpiece of materialist history, as he understands it, is the dialectical image, a constellation of the past and the present perceived all at once. The juxtaposition of past and present is meant to offer a radical reframing of the now, rendering newly visible what he calls the real state of emergency. The dialectical image, as he conceives of it, posits a dynamic relationship between the past and the present, rejecting the linear monodirectionality of historicism, along with its implicit narrative of progress. In articulating the dialectical image, Benjamin writes, "It is not that what is past casts its light on what is present, or what is present is light on what is past. Rather, what has been comes together in a clash with the now to form a constellation." In other words, image is dialectics at a standstill. For while the relation of the present to the past is purely temporal, the relation of the what has been to the now is dialectical, not only temporal in nature, but figural, bildlich. This practice also enables us to see the past and the present as mirror images of one another instead of as origin and telos. But Benjamin is also explaining here that the temporality of the constellation is reversible. An image from the past erupts in the present, and in this moment, in this standstill, what was past sheds light on the now, and the now sheds light on the past. And it does so in the service of a potentially different future, as it represents, in Benjamin's words, a revolutionary chance in the struggle for the suppressed past. He perceives it in order to explode a specific epoch out of the homogeneous course of history. In this constellation, the dialectical image, both the past and the present are reframed, rendered newly visible in a way that opens up the possibility of a different future. In this sense, Benjamin's materialist history is also and decidedly political, geared toward waking us to the obscured reality of the present so that we can change course. Now back to the second aspect of Benjamin's formulation. He imagines the dialectical image in explicitly visual terms. The relation of the what has been to the now, he says, is figural, bildlich. Why does his account of materialist history hinge as it does on the pictorial, on the visual, as opposed to the written or purely conceptual? One cannot help but understand this in relation to his interest in and hopes for the visual technologies of modernity, photography and film, to bring about social change, which I touched on briefly before. It might very well be the case that these visual technologies, and here I'm including television as well, are a privileged arena for the construction and apprehension of dialectical images. And third, in suggesting that the project of articulating the past historically does not require that we recognize how it really was, Benjamin suggests that the dialectical image might be genuinely historical in his words, even if it's not predicated on the logics or conventions of realism. And indeed, the text in which I will turn to shortly are texts that rely on some combination of realism and science fiction or fantasy in the construction of dialectical images, in the production of a materialist history. So what I'm proposing here is that filmic and televisual texts, and I'm pointing here to the recent outpouring of fictional film and television shows that take race and racial violence as their subject matter, might be a privileged site for such a political materialist form of history writing. Furthermore, I want to suggest that the formal properties of audiovisual texts, in particular film and television, due to their modes of narration and the conventional techniques of editing, make them uniquely capable of staging complex temporal relations of bringing unexpected and forgotten pasts into contact with the present, of creating, as it were, dialectical images upon which a materialist history might be constructed. What I want ultimately to suggest is that these dialectical images, constellations of past and present, are, in the cases I will consider, instances of the eruption of racial histories in the present that serve as interruptions of racial histories in the present, reframing both the past and the present in order to open up the possibility of a different future. Through conventions of filmic narrative, which often eschew linear chronologies, and the temporal possibilities enabled by filmic editing, these audiovisual media, I suggest, are uniquely positioned to produce the kind of dialectical images Benjamin theorizes. And in fact, many scholars of film have pointed to film's complex relationship to temporality. Practices of editing allow temporal flashbacks in which the past is literally rendered present, fully visualized. We as viewers in those instances see its relationship both to a cinematic, diegetic present and to our own non-diegetic real-world present. These cinematically enabled confrontations between the past and the past flashing up, as it were, are literalizations of Benjamin's dialectical images. And as I will suggest in my 3 cases shortly, the flashing up of these memories of racial violence aim to reveal the ways in which the commodification and exploitation of Black bodies and the persistence of racialized violence in the US are not actually of the past, but ongoing in myriad ways in the present. Seeing that the past is actually the present. Saidiya Hartman, a preeminent scholar of race in the US, has powerfully articulated the afterlives of slavery, a conceptualization meant to engage a complex temporality that, like Benjamin's dialectical image, rejects the progressivism of historicism. Her formulation is aimed at making visible the ways in which aspects of slavery live on in the present. In the same vein, Christina Sharp has described what she calls the wake, the track left on the water's surface by a ship, and in particular, a slave ship. The wake is also meant to invoke a palpable affective experience of trauma, even after the ship has long passed. But these afterlives, this wake, is not and has not ever been equally visible or palpable to all. Indeed, the popular and deeply entrenched triumphalist narrative of racial progress in the US has worked to obscure and overwrite those afterlives, the wake. What is required then is a revision, and I'm intentionally emphasizing the word vision here, of the national narrative, because filmic and televisual texts are formally adept at constructing alternative temporal relations that the standard narratives of racial progress in the US and the temporal logic of historicism more generally elide. By bringing unexpected paths into contact with both the filmic and extra-filmic, non-diegetic present, film and television as media might stage visually and orally a past fully alive in the present. To demonstrate this, I will touch down very briefly in 3 texts. Each is rich and complicated, so I will limit my focus to moments where I see constructions of dialectical images. And I'm going to look at Get Out, the 2017 film by Jordan Peele, the HBO miniseries Watchmen by Damon Lindelof, and the HBO miniseries Lovecraft Country by Misha Green. In Jordan Peele's acclaimed 2017 horror film Get Out, the main characters, Rose Armitage and Chris Washington, are a hip interracial couple who travel together to her family's home in upstate New York, where her parents will meet Chris, her African-American boyfriend, for the first time. What we learn over the course of this trip home is that despite Rose's woke, social justice warrior pose, she and her parents are actually sadistic racists who sedate and then sell the African-American men she lures to her family home for their own economic gain. Rather than analyze the entire film, which I've done elsewhere, I will focus on one scene here, the one that most powerfully creates a dialectical image aimed at bringing the present to crisis. In this scene, the Armitage family is hosting their annual garden party. While there are a series of clues that something is off, that the guests are weirdly overinterested in Chris, The full horror of the situation only gradually unfolds.
I think you've met Logan before.
No, I don't know Logan. I knew the guy that come at me. I think your mom got in my head, right? I think she
Are calling out prices. The party guests, seated in rows, raise their cards to bid as he calls out prices. At first, we don't know what they're bidding on, but eventually the camera pulls back far enough to reveal a portrait of Chris propped up on an easel beside Dean. This innocent garden party is gradually revealed to be a slave auction. In this scene, Chris is sold to a blind gallery owner whose consciousness will be transplanted into Chris's body. The audience is meant to experience visceral shock as we are asked to fundamentally reimagine what's taking place. In this scene, we witness a modern-day slave auction in supposedly liberal bourgeois America. The slave auction is here conjured up not as it actually was, but in a meaningful relationship to the present. In this way, the film literalizes a science fiction version of enslavement in which white people steal Black bodies and use them for their own purposes and profit. By setting this slavery in the present day, the film points to the violence still perpetrated against African Americans, suggesting that racialized violence and exploitation continues even among supposedly liberal white people. By depicting a slave auction, white people at a garden party literally bidding on a Black body, the film performs a radical form of history writing, bringing the present into contact with an unexpected past, precisely to interrupt the present, to serve as a wake-up call. In this moment, what has been the white exploitation of Black bodies in the US comes together in a clash with the now to form a constellation. This dialectical image of Chris, an African-American human being for sale in 2017 New York, is, in Benjamin's words, genuinely historical, in that it's an image that becomes legible in the now of its recognizability. The slave auction in the present forces us to reread the present in a radically different way, to see that we had been misrecognizing it all along. The HBO series Watchmen, created by Damon Lindelof, was imagined as a sequel to the Marvel comic of the same name. However, unlike its predecessor, this iteration foregrounds white supremacy and racialized violence, and in particular, the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. This text, like many other films, museums, and television shows that I consider my larger project, force a collective reckoning with a submerged history of racial violence, which continues into the present. To center race and racialized violence as it does requires the Watchmen series to depart in significant ways from the original narrative of the comic book. As creator Lindelof said in an interview with NPR, at the time I was sort of approached to consider rethinking Watchmen, I had to answer the question, what's the pervasive sort of anxiety in America right now? And it was impossible, as all these things were happening, not just Charlottesville, but everything that was happening through the lens of race. And it felt like there was a great reckoning happening in our country, overdue and necessary. And I started to feel like it was incredibly important to tell a story about race, end quote. That the HBO sequel represents a thematic departure from the earlier iteration is clear from the outset. Lindelof's Watchmen is set in Tulsa in 2019 in an alternative present from our own, in which liberal President Redford's administration approved reparations for victims of racial injustice and their descendants. This controversial policy in the show led to extreme and racialized violence, which is erupting again in the present of the series. There's much to discuss here, including, I think, a literalization of prosthetic memory, which I've discussed elsewhere, but I want to focus again here explicitly on the construction of dialectical images. The opening scene of the pilot is set in Tulsa, Oklahoma, during the violent and devastating, yet largely unremembered race massacre of 1921. In the opening moments of the series, there are two distinct moments in which a memory flashes up. The first is a scene on the screen. In an almost empty Tulsa movie theater, as a young African-American boy watches a silent film about Bass Reeves, the first Black Marshal of Oklahoma. And the second is the scene that follows, in which we watch the little boy carried by his father through the main streets of Tulsa during the riots, amid brutal and vividly depicted acts of violence against African Americans. Importantly, this flashing up of an image of the past occurs both diegetically and non-diegetically for the boy in the cinema and for the viewing audience. In a self-reflexive gesture, the series foregrounds the significance of cinematic spectatorship, of the encounter with images from the past. Here's the opening scene. change his present and future. He's riveted by the scene before him, reciting from memory a line from the film, "There will be no mob justice today, trust in the law." And then on the screen, Bass Reeves repeats the same words. The power of this memory, which flashes on the screen before him, we learn only later. The little boy in the theater, Will, takes on the name Reeves and the mantle of law enforcement when he becomes a figure of hooded justice. This image of Bass Reeves flashes up for Will in a moment of danger, and he appropriates it in the service of a different future. But this is also a scene in which an image of the past appears for us, the audience, in what it asks us to understand as our moment of danger. Like the boy in the cinema, we, the audience, are not only brought into contact with the historical figure of Bass Reeves, the first Black deputy U.S. Marshal in Oklahoma, but also with the unfolding scene of destruction in the cinema, which we soon understand as the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. There's a cut to the scene outside, the film now sepia-toned, with titles that say Tulsa 1921. A scene of chaos, mob violence on the streets, the looting of stores unfolds before us. African Americans are gunned down in the streets by low-flying planes. The boy and his parents emerge from the cinema, and then, through point-of-view shots, we witness the violence and destruction through the boy's eyes. White men with torches threatening African Americans, hurling Molotov cocktails into businesses. The boy's parents crouch behind a car, witness to other African Americans shot and in flames. The parents make a quick decision in order to save their boy. They bundle him into the back of a wagon with a note reassuring him that he's going to be okay and that they'll be right behind him, which of course is not what happens. For many white spectators in the US, this television series marks their first encounter with the Tulsa Race Massacre, also known as the Black Wall Street Massacre, in which approximately 300 African Americans were murdered. Unlike other formative moments in US history, this one has gone largely unacknowledged, omitted from US history curricula and the national narrative. What I'm suggesting is not simply that this is an act of recovery, but rather that in 2019, this appears as another version of our present, pushing us to see the connection between the racialized violence of that past and the racialized violence of our present, to see in a new way our present landscape. I turn now and briefly to the HBO television series Lovecraft Country, created by Misha Green and based on the novel by Matt Ruff. Like the novel, the series borrows some of the fantasy elements of the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, who was a renowned racist, but in the service of an engagement with critical histories of racial violence in the US, histories which we are meant to see as animating not just the past, but the show's present, 1950s, as well as our own. As with Get Out and Watchmen, the writing of history is not premised on logics of realism, and in fact uses fantasy and science fiction in its construction of dialectical images. Set in Chicago and Massachusetts and Oklahoma in the 1950s, but with time travel into other periods as well, the narrative is set in motion by a letter that Atticus Freeman received from his estranged father, Montrose, asking Atticus to join him on a mission to uncover his dead mother, Dora's ancestry. However, when Atticus arrives in Chicago, he discovers that his father, Montrose, has gone missing. In what ensues, he teams up with his old friend Letty, his uncle George, and others to find his missing father. In their journey across 1950s Jim Crow America, they meet monsters that are both real and imagined, and they have to struggle to overcome the racist terror of white America. Atticus and Letty, like Uncle George and Aunt Hippolyta, who published the Safe Negro Travel Guidebooks, work in a series to create spaces of safety and community for African Americans in the face of rampant and virulent racism in 1955 Chicago, the year in which Chicago native Emmett Till was murdered. Once again, for the sake of time, I'll point to just one scene in which the series constructs a dialectical image, requiring us to rethink how we see both the past and the present. In episode 8, the storylines of the characters intersect with the open casket funeral of Emmett Till, who was a friend of Hippolyta's daughter, Dee. At first, we don't know that we are at the scene of a funeral. us to the final words of Eric Garner, murdered by police officers in New York City. Here in this moment, the past and the present are fused, mirror images of one another. This is dialectics at a standstill. Here, the past, a long history of violence against African Americans, casts light on the present, but the present, our current epidemic of police violence against African Americans, even the brutal murder of children like Tamir Rice, casts light on the past. In this scene, on the day of Emmett Till's funeral, these words, "I can't breathe," connect her to Eric Garner's of the future, which is our present, a constellation, a dialectical image, from Emmett Till to D in a Chokehold to Eric Garner's, whose last words were, "I can't breathe." And this is my conclusion. This past is not behind us. This past of brutal violence, of racialized violence, is our present too. And yet the powerful national narrative of an overcoming of racial injustice is the story America tells of itself. It's a narrative that relies on the progressive linearity of conventional historicism. This form of history writing, I've tried to suggest, relies on a temporal schema in which the present is severed from the past, and as such is less able to articulate a past ongoing or alive in the present. Moreover, what I've tried to suggest is that mass culture has become a site for an unconventional, radical form of history writing, enabled in part by its specific formal mechanisms for producing meaning, editing and narration, both of which enable more complex depictions of the relationship between past and present in order to change course. And because these media are mass media with broad appeal in large audiences, they have the potential to chip away at the deeply entrenched narratives of racial progress in the US, to counter those narratives that place racial violence safely in the past. These dialectical images, the chokehold, the slave auction, are shattering. They sear through the now, offering us the possibility, perhaps even demanding, a different future.
Okay, can you hear me? Everybody can hear me? Thank you, Alison. I was just informed by the technicians here that the streaming on Facebook was, because some people follow via Facebook as well, it was interrupted because apparently Facebook recognized copyrighted images, and then it automatically shuts off, and now they're trying to start it again. But people on Zoom will be able to continue to follow us, and we are all here, of course, still. So I would like to open the floor for questions. I see Anna Mawad here already. I see John Raz as well. Let's start with Anna here, and then Wolf. So Anna, John, and Wolf, I propose we gather questions and then have Alison respond, and then I'll do a second round. Is that okay? We start with these three questions. Anna?
Hello, Alison. Good morning. I wish you were here so we can have coffee and talk a little bit more. Your conference is just great, and I'm really, really happy to see that our reflections are going together in to the same direction. I would like to ask you, I will be very objective, about, I perfectly agree with you in your theoretical frame, and actually I've been working almost with the same authors, and I don't know if you know the essay of Carlo Ginzburg, who connect Walter Benjamin and Siegfried Krakauer about the close-up. It's a very interesting essay. But my question to you, it's about the concept of experience in Benjamin, because I think it's central for the spectatorship that is created in 21st century. And also, I'd like to know if you had already written any piece about Spike Lee last movie of Ku Klux Klan. I don't know, in Brazil they have another name. We always translate to different titles. But it's just, if you have, please give me the reference, because I think this is one of the best films I have ever seen in my life. It's very good. Thank you, Alison.
Thank you.
So then we first switch to John. So we're mixing. John, can you hear us? and so on.
Yes, yes, yes. Wow. Wow. An absolutely brilliant exposition. It's given me so much to think about. I think I'd add just one comment, which is, Wilhelm Flusser's, that the photographs not only show us, not only are constellations of the past and the present, but they also structure the future and our perception of the future. And it's so wonderful to see the films you've mentioned because I have the feeling in the US that historical film, at least documentary film, is dominated by Ken Burns. It's like a Stalinist state. I've never seen, a state where professional historians are simply not allowed to make films. But thank you very much. It's given me so much to think about, and I hope we can dialogue at some point in the future.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then Wolf.
A very quick question. I'm wondering how you would compare and contrast the visual strategies you have just shown us with the visual strategies of the 60s, 70s as the precursors of the development of the visuality of cosmopolitanism and prosthetic memory. Because I find so interesting some parallels, the puncturing, the invasion of the past into the present is an interesting part, I would say, maybe not as mainstream, but often present in the television of the 60s and 70s, where the crimes of National Socialism then also are performed on screen and laying an interesting foundation for the explicit memory developed afterwards. But how would you compare the strategies that we find then to the ones we find now?
Okay, Alison?
Thank you so much. I guess I'll start there because it's in my head. What I think is really interesting, I mean, obviously, and I think I tried to say this, that film has always relied on flashbacks, and played with temporality in this way. So, the sort of joining of past and present is not necessarily new. But what I think is different here is that we're meant to see the past and the present as mirror images of each other. And so it's this sort of like we're really literally seeing a slave auction in the present, right? So it's not that like we're asked to let's think about this past in relation to the present. We're seeing it visualized. And, and there's a kind of reversibility too. I mean, I think that the chokehold scene in Lovecraft is so astonishing because it's really sort of it's asking us to not just see the light that the past sheds on the present, but to see the light that the present sheds on the past. So that's the way in which it seems different to me. Although I think film as a medium has always been able to play with temporality in sort of powerful ways. I don't know if that answers your question exactly or not. Okay, great. And then Anna, I have not written on Spike Lee's film, so I'm sorry to say, but I think the category of experience is enormously important. And I think, and this is something that I get into very extensively in prosthetic memory. I mean, what I talk about in that book is, what I argue is that these audiovisual media produce the possibility for an individual to encounter in an intimate, personal way an experience of a past that they didn't actually live through. And that there's obviously a strongly powerfully affective dimension to that this becomes a sort of site of experience, of actual experience. And that's how sort of this prosthetic memory acquisition takes place. So to me, that's a sort of crucial part of my understanding of the cinematic apparatus, both the apparatus itself, and I think also I think he was also interested in the collective nature of the reception of the cinema, which I think we have to think about differently in our contemporary era. Nevertheless, these are shows that huge audiences watch. And so there's a kind of collective reception, one could argue, in this instance as well. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not, Anna.
Okay, I see Lars has a question in the back. Is that correct? And then I see that online there's also two questions, Tamika and Luke. Let's have these three in a round again, and I'm afraid these will be the last three because we're going a little bit over time. Lars?
Thank you very much, Alison, not only for this presentation, but also for the claims and remarks you made in several other sessions. I like this very much. If I understood you right, you pointed the finger on history writing, on the problem of history writing, of always trying somehow to harmonize the past and the present in a moment of crisis, so bring it somehow into a logical order or into a moral order or something like this. And this is something which media and mass media culture does not have to do, because it points the finger on the problem without solving the problem in the same moment. This problem of mainstream history writing is maybe the same as Wolf Kannsteiner explained us yesterday, of immersion, of trying to, to get rid of the problem by bringing it into an order. But wouldn't be it then a choice to form something like a new way of, or a more critical way of history writing, which doesn't try to solve the problem or bridge the gap between the past and the present by pointing the finger on the problem without always having a solution in the first place, and without creating immersive situations where everybody can feel cozy.
Okay, then I'm moving to Tamika online. Can you hear us?
Hey, am I coming in loud and clear? Fantastic. Alison, that was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. Every time I hear or read something from you, it's just like, it's just fantastic. Always just changing the game for me. I have so many questions, so let me see if I can formulate my thoughts. So I feel like what I'm getting from your presentation is, of course, the possibility of visual media and the opportunities that we have in visual media to bring together the past and the present and make the past prescient for today. But of course, with great power comes great responsibility, right? So with visual media and visual culture, it can also be quite deceptive or misleading. A photograph can tell lies, so I'm thinking about a lot of stuff that we see shared on social media with fake news and misinformation and things like that. And I feel like although there's amazing opportunities in what you just described in those fabulous films and TV shows, there's also opportunities for people to create very misleading or very perhaps damaging and misconstrued juxtapositions between the past and the present. So as a discipline, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how we sort of navigate that, or how we deal with that, the sort of the dark side of the light that you're describing today.
Okay.
Am I answering now, or are we taking another question?
Just still Luke's question, and then I'll give the floor to you again. Luke?
Thanks. Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, speak a
Yes.
bit louder.
Thank you, Alison. Yeah, I would like to push back on this critique of historicism a little, actually. So I think I agree with you that, the racist narrative of the American past is not really about the past. It's about the present and the future. It's about trying to avoid change, and this is why you claim there's no longer a problem with racism, for example, because then there's nothing to fix. We don't need to do anything. Okay, that part I think is sound. But the idea that this is anything to do with historicism as the explanation of truth about the past, I think is more questionable insofar as first of all, I mean, historiography supported racism, no doubt, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but the idea of historiography as, in a professional sense, technical sense, as any kind of main cause of racism seems at least, again, questionable, that the causes of racism are economic, cultural, religious, social, and so on. The professional history and historicism played a very small role in that. Moreover, it seems to me that the racist and progressive narratives are both involved in this argument about the present and the future. Historicism as explanation of the truth about the past never really get to look in here. You've got a moral and political argument in which the causes of slavery, for example, never really come in. So, I mean, that's seen in Watchmen. You don't see an explanation of what's happening in 1921 in Tulsa, you just see a representation of it. And the historicist concern is with precisely the explanation. But of course, an explanation doesn't help with dealing with a moral and political problem. You can know the truth about why slavery happened. It won't help you fix contemporary racism. So I can see that historicism is sort of non-contributory if what you want is an answer to, you know, the current problems that the United States continues to have, and you're right about all those. You know, I'm not questioning your, as it were, your contemporary diagnosis, but I think that Benjamin is, you know, flawed in his understanding of what historicism actually means, and I don't really think it helps you make your argument to invoke historicism there. I think you have plenty of material on other grounds by which you can make the case, but the critique of historicism is a little bit of a red herring in what you've said. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Luke. So I want to begin by saying that I don't hold historicism responsible for racism, or history writing responsible for racism. What I'm trying to suggest is that some of the embedded logics of historicism, in which one is insisting on a sort of difference between the present and the past, makes it harder to see historical continuity. And so it's more sort of the temporal dimensions of historicism that I am calling attention to, not that history as a discipline is working to sort of to do this intentionally. I'm sort of talking about the sort of methodological requirements of certain sort of conventional forms of history writing. I also want to, in response to what you're saying, what was the other point? I lost my train of thought.
Man, you've got other questions to respond to, so
okay.
I'll pick up on this later, but deal with the others.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think also, I guess I just wanted to say, that I'm also not suggesting. I mean, there are plenty of academic historians who have done, you know, groundbreaking work on the continuity of racial violence in the U.S. I mean, what I'm talking about is a large-scale national narrative, and I'm saying that this national narrative, like a national myth, is the history that America in sort of in a popular mode tells about itself. So I'm not actually assessing the work of historians. Historians, you know, have done really important groundbreaking work in the US around precisely these issues, but those interpretations have not gained traction. And it's this sort of, and so the historicist, I think the sort of linear narrative, progressive narrative underpinning of this national myth has made it very difficult to dismantle. And so I'm interested in the arena of mass culture, which might be a site for sort of challenging those national myths, because of its, you know, ability to speak to sort of so many large audience, such a large audience, has the capacity maybe to chip away at these sort of national mythologies. But thank you for that question. Tamika, to your question, you know, I think, as you know, if you've read my work, I am always thinking in a sort of utopian vein, right? I mean, obviously, most of mass culture doesn't work in the sort of radical ways that I'm imagining, right? I mean, like, I'm inspired by Walter Benjamin, in large part because, you know, he was living through, you know, a period of crisis, and he was still trying to imagine a different future. He was still trying to identify sites of possibility, right? And so my work is like that too. Yes, I mean, of course, I mean, I think the reason we have a lot of these popular national narratives about the US, we can fault mass media for that, right? But what I want to suggest is that these are very powerful media and have the capacity to perform a kind of history writing. And I'm always looking for those moments where I think something more radical or counter-hegemonic is happening. And now I'm not even remembering the first question. I'm sorry.
Lars
Lars.
from Lars Deile, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think we'll have to be rounding up here because, sadly so, because I see there are many other questions, but of course we can't endanger the start of the next sessions. I would like to thank you all for being here, and of course, most of all, Alison for presenting this wonderful paper, and clearly one that provokes much more potential discussion than we were able to accommodate in this session. But I'm sure people will be able to email you or get in touch, right, Alison? I'm sure you want to go.
Absolutely. Absolutely, I would welcome that. And I mean, I'm also willing to sort of sit online here if any of the other people wanted to actually ask questions. I'm happy to, release everybody and just stay here if anybody wants to. I see there's some people on Zoom to continue,
that is, of course, possible,
yeah, I mean, but thank you so much. I really enjoyed the comments and the feedback, and I'm going to save the chat so that if there are other questions in there, I'll try to respond. But please do email me if you have questions that you want to, or, want to have discussion. I'm happy to do that. Lisa, if you want to go ahead and ask a question.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I was